Today's video is a little bit longer than normal, but if you like my work, do make the time to either watch or listen all the way through. In spite of my voice starting to give out and crack a bit partway through this one, and a little recording glitch near the end that makes Steven sound like he's calling from the bottom of the ocean, this is, in my opinion, the best video on my channel. The crowning jewel of Stated Casually. In part, this is because Steven and I got along super well. He was really great to present with. But also, a lot of the information here has never been presented in a form that's accessible to the general public. The papers that I base my presentation on can be easily found online, but if you don't have a good grasp of biochemistry, those papers are really hard to understand. I'm not shy to say this video is an important contribution to the public conversation about genetics. So why did Steven and I get together and record this? Well, the past almost 10 years, I have had what you could call a secret hobby. Whenever I hear a public figure talk about genetics or genetic research incorrectly, instead of complaining about it on Twitter, I will call or email the person. This might be YouTubers, journalists, radio hosts, public health officials, creationists, you name it. In my first contact, I introduce myself, I explain briefly and in the friendliest possible manner what the error is and why I think it's worth correcting, and then I offer to meet privately, confidentially, to discuss. As you might imagine, in some cases my emails are simply ignored, but usually that's not the case. I almost always hear back from people, and sometimes we do actually meet. Stephen Woodford, better known by the name of his YouTube channel, Rationality Rules, is the only person who has wanted me to record and then publish our conversation. He did that because he really cares about transparency. He cares about intellectual honesty. I am a longtime fan of Stephen's channel, Rationality Rules. He discusses atheism and philosophy with a focus on the logic and the fallacies that people use in their arguments. He's even produced a really cool card game called Debunked. You can learn about that and buy it at debunkedcardgame.com. The conversation you're about to hear led us to remake a video that he had done on DNA. The original had several errors in it. In the video description below, you'll find links to our new video, just now published on his channel. The title and thumbnail might be different from what you're seeing here, but the link should work. And there is a link to the old video that we replaced. He delisted it from YouTube's search results, so it won't continue to give out bad info. But for the sake of full transparency, he asked that I give you a direct link, so you can still watch that. There's a bunch of great stuff in our conversation. We start by talking about the argument creationists have been making, where they claim that DNA is evidence for God. His first video aimed to debunk that argument, and part of his video was great, but he missed a few important issues, and some of the things that he said were just not correct. I do a general overview of biological communication systems, so communication systems that naturally evolved. We then talk about signaling theory, and during that part of the conversation, we go off on a little tangent about some trouble that he got into when he was criticizing certain aspects of the transgender movement. And finally, I present what we do and do not know about the origin of the genetic code. Stephen was the perfect person for this conversation. He had lots of questions, great insight, and he wasn't shy to push back when he disagreed about my views or tactics on how to best deal with the anti-evolution crowd. So you will get to witness a bit of atheist versus atheist combat here, which is always fun, and I'm sure creationists will get a kick out of seeing some infighting. Without further ado, I give you the great Stephen Woodford. Welcome. It's super cool to have you on. It seems like it's more and more rare, maybe I'm just noticing it more, for people to actually want a different point of view. We have this pride issue that doesn't let us want to do this.
As Chucky D behind you, that lovely drawing that you did, we bear the stamp of our lowly origin, and part of that lowly origin is just not being able to admit when you get something wrong, and it's like no, you can't calmly educate me, John. That's not okay. But no, thanks for reaching out. It's always a pleasure. I've been a fan of your content for as long as I can remember watching YouTube. So when you reached out to me, I was like, oh man, this is awesome. But also, oh no, I got something wrong. It actually reminds me of when Matt Dillahunty reached out to me for the first time. I was like, what? Matt Dillahunty just reached out to me, and he was telling me I was wrong on something, and I was like, "This is a trend. I've got to stop." But no, seriously, thanks for reaching out. Like, we're going to put this correct. And actually, one thing that I think is worth doing is I will unlist the old video after this call, and I will start remaking the remastered version. And if you'd be willing and able, I'd love for you to look over the script, to look over the execution, and just basically make sure that I get it right. So if you're up for that, that'd be amazing. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Do you consider your channel like an atheist channel or a philosophy channel? How do you...
Yeah, good question. I would say yes, it is part of the atheist community, but more so, especially in recent time, I'm just going my own way, doing philosophy and whatnot, but it's definitely part of the atheist community, and like, I'm a proud member of that, and I'm happy to associate with... I've seen some of my colleagues disassociating themselves from new atheism, but I'm like, no, I'm fine with that. That's all good. Yeah. So no, I would say it's an atheist channel, or an atheist perspective on philosophical investigations, like you can put it that way, or just, attacking theists, whatever you wish.
I really appreciate your channel. I do recommend it for anyone who hasn't gone over there to see it. Rationality Rules. A lot of the things on there are atheist arguments, but even if you're religious, it's cool to listen to these arguments and try and digest them. That's good for you, right?
Yeah, healthy.
Yeah. So there is this problem that I've been noticing for years now. Every time I talk about the genetic code in my videos, people will argue in the comments. Christians will say that the genetic code is evidence of God. I'll get atheists that say, no, the genetic code isn't really code, or it's not really anything like a language or a code. That's just an analogy that scientists use. And that's the argument that atheists have been making. The thing is that hurts my heart about that argument is that there are some incredible linguistic properties about the genetic code, like really fascinating things about it that we're throwing out when we try and make that argument. Because most creationists use their definitions kind of weird, there are ways to make an argument and say that, oh, you're just using the word language to confuse yourself. And in many cases, that's actually partially true. But there really are genuine linguistic properties about the genetic code that demand an explanation. And so creationists, even if they're technically wrong about like why it is that they think the genetic code is special, they are right to think the code is special because it really is. The goal that I have today is to explain what those special linguistic properties are and what we do know and don't know about how they formed through the evolutionary process. So,
well, what I'll do then is I will work as a good old soundboard. I'll throw questions your way, of course. And I'll try and explain more why, like if you're a creationist that's watching this, or just someone that doesn't accept evolution, don't know if that's the same thing, but if you're watching this and you're thinking, why is it that atheists say this? I think I might be able to get you to understand that perspective a bit better. So hopefully this is just something that helps everybody with clarity, really.
Yeah. This is actually from your video. You lay out this syllogism. So creationists have framed this argument in lots of different ways. But you broke it down really nicely. And you're saying that the main points they're making, they're saying that language is a product of a mind. It's always a product of a mind. And sometimes they'll say code instead. So code is a product of a mind, or language is a product of a mind. DNA is a language, or DNA is a code. Therefore, DNA is a product of a mind. So that is the argument that creationists are making when they try to say that the genetic code is evidence of intelligent design. And the part of this syllogism that you attacked in your video is you attacked the idea that DNA is a language, or the genetic code is a code, has these linguistic properties. Yep. And that's actually the wrong premise to attack. It is true that sometimes the way that they're defining terms as weird, there are ways to attack it, but there really are linguistic properties about the genetic code that are special. And the thing that we should be addressing is that languages are not always the product of a mind. We actually know of another process, the process of evolution happens to be, that can also generate signal-based or symbol-based communication systems. And this is well understood at this point in history. There are details about the actual origin of the genetic code that are not super well understood, but we do understand in principle how things like the genetic code can emerge through the process of evolution. that's where this argument should be made, because the creationists are wrong and their conclusion is wrong, but for a different reason than most atheists are saying.
Well, I can expand on this a bit, which will probably be helpful. So if you take another argument that's used for the existence of a God, say the Kalam, premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe had a cause. Then there's like stage 2, where you try and derive from stage 1 the properties of what that cause would be, and that's where you're meant to get to God, a divine being, with the properties that you find, omnipresence, omnipotence, etc. Now, when addressing the Kalam, the way in which someone uses a word can very often determine which premise the contention is on. So, for example, it depends on how they define universe. So if they was to define universe as our local space-time manifold, then that's a very different claim to saying the totality of everything. So to contextualize this with this argument, for me, it depends on who I'm interacting with as to which premise to focus on. And what I'll try and expand upon as we get through a few more slides is that I actually think that focusing on premise 2 here is correct, depending on who you're talking with. But because I focused exclusively on that, I do entirely realize that I missed a trick with the first premise, and in doing so, gave this impression, or maybe even just straight up, ignored the fact that there are these wonderful properties with DNA which absolutely do count as a language if it's defined in a certain way. So yeah, I just wanted to give you a bit of resistance on that front, because I think that's where a lot of the contention's happening. There's a lot of miscommunication, well, not so much miscommunication, but there's a lot of conversations happening at once referring to this argument.
It is true that there are lots of different definitions of the word language, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Different fields of science that study languages and language-like systems, they use actually different definitions, and there's a lot of confusion around this subject, but I really don't like attacking premise number 2. And maybe I'm too hardcore with this, like maybe I need to back off a little bit, maybe it's okay to attack premise number 2, but the reason it breaks my heart when people do this is that there really are these linguistic properties that the genetic code has that are spectacular, and I don't want that baby tossed out with the bathwater. I want to steelman the creationist argument. I want to say, yes, the genetic code is very language-like. It's got linguistic properties, but we now know that things that are like languages, they don't always have to come from minds. These things can come about naturally, and scientists now understand this process very, very well. I like to steelman their argument.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's I'm totally on board with that. And I definitely would say that my first video did not steelman it. Whereas what I can do now is, by addressing both horns, various definitions of how language is used, you can absolutely look at the stronger claim where DNA absolutely is a language, and it does cry out for admiration at the very least.
It's like seeing a crazy sunset or mountain range. It's just, for me, I mean, it takes a little bit of, you got to learn some biochemistry to really understand how spectacular it is. But once you understand it, you're like, wow, this is really amazing. No wonder people are trying to use this. Anything that inspires awe, people will use for religious. That's the religious feeling, is this feeling of awe that we get when we're looking at something amazing.
It's where awesome comes from, yeah.
There are 2 false claims that creationists are making that are separate claims, and your video also sort of conflated these 2, but they also conflate them when they're making them. So one claim is the creationists will say that it's impossible for new genetic information to evolve. Information can only be created by thinking minds. So that's one thing, and your video actually addresses that. Gene sequences can easily change. So the information in a genome can change just through the process of evolution. Yeah. The second claim that they're making, which is a very different claim, is that languages and codes can only be created by thinking minds, and that if the genetic code is a language or a code, it must have been made by God.
Yep.
That second one you sort of brushed aside. This is the difference here. So here, this box that I'm showing you here, this is what we call the genetic code. This is basically the dictionary of the genetic code. There are 64 symbols in the genetic code, or 64 words. And it is this language, these symbols that have been assigned. Each symbol, each codon is what each symbol is called. They're called codons. And they are 3 DNA nucleotides or RNA nucleotides. And they have been assigned somehow throughout the history of evolution to represent 20 different types of amino acids. There's also a start command and a stop command. These allow genes to send messages and messenger RNA to ribosomes, which can read the embedded information in the chain of RNA, and they read it according to these rules, this genetic code here, this chart here. The fact that we have symbols here that are not just dictated by physics, they're actually dictated by the evolved structure of the ribosome and transfer RNAs. These things had to be assigned through an evolutionary process, or I suppose they could have been assigned through an intelligent design process as well. But there had to be an assignment that happened of these symbols to the amino acids that they represent. And for those of you listening and you're like, what the heck does all of that mean? That sounds like crazy talk. Don't worry, we're going to go over this in detail. I'm just kind of giving you a taste here. This is the question we want to ask. How were codons assigned their specific meanings? That is the special question that creationists are right to ask. This guy, Susumu Ono, he focused on how new genetic information evolves. His big, I don't know if it was really his discovery, but he really drove home the importance of gene duplication in the process of evolution. In the process, especially in our genome, there's tons of genes that have been duplicated and then slightly modified after duplication through point mutations and so on. He showed not just how you get new versions of information that already existed, but how it is that the genome of an organism, of a species, will expand.
It might be useful to give an example, a very tangible, physical example of something that is new genetic information.
Okay. One really good example of new genetic information that evolved through a gene duplication followed by point mutations would be the venom molecules that snakes have. A lot of them are normal genes that all tetrapods have. So all backboned vertebrates have, that have been duplicated, and the duplicate is expressed in their saliva glands. And so you've got a molecule, it's actually, they're signaling molecules, a lot of them, that our bodies use, cells will use to signal to each other to make sure that everything's running properly. And the snake just injects those in high concentrations into our blood, and that causes chaos in our bodies, and it makes us die. A bunch of these, not all of them, but a bunch of the venom molecules are just normal housekeeping proteins that the snake already had, that they were duplicated and expressed in its saliva glands, and it's now used as venom. And there are little point mutations and things that have happened in those genes in the millennia since being incorporated into the venom that actually make them more potent. I've got an animation on that, how does new genetic information evolve, and it's part 2 in that series, where I talk about the venom specifically.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite videos that you've made.
Cool.
But just to get further clarity on that, does that mean that from the very moment there was a mutation, that's genetic information? And does it have to count as new genetic information? And can it only count as new genetic information if it helps the organism proliferate and succeed? Or is basically every mutation classed as a new genetic information, even if it's a duplicate of something that was already there?
Well, I mean, the information itself, if you really want to get technical on what we mean when we're talking about information. In biology, when we're talking about information, we're talking about sequence information, the sequence of nucleotides. So in that case, it doesn't even matter if it's adaptive or not. If it's changed, it's new. But if you want to talk about adaptive information, new functional information, then yeah, you'd want to say that it has to be useful to the animal. This snake example is a really good example of the hardest case. It's not just new information; it's new functional information that's helping that organism survive and reproduce. This guy's work was absolutely amazing. We already knew that about point mutations; they edit existing information, but this is how you expand it really rapidly. I mean, there are other ways to expand it too, but this is how it happens really rapidly. And there's lots of signs when we look into the human genome and in the genomes of any organism that this is a major process in evolution, in the formation of new genetic information. Carl Woese focused really on the ribosome, which is that structure I was showing earlier. His big focus was on the ribosome, and he wanted to understand how the genetic code evolved. He talks about codon assignments. How were these codons assigned their meaning? And that will make sense later on in this presentation, if that doesn't make sense to people right now. He discovered some really cool things during his career. He didn't totally solve the problem in all of the detail that we would want it to be solved, and it's actually still being worked out, but the general principles we now understand quite well. Because of his work and because of the work of others in a subfield of evolutionary biology called signaling theory, we have a really good understanding of how codes can evolve naturally. In your video, you conflated those two, and then you mainly focused on the origin of new genetic information. And for the creationists that wanted to know your argument about the origin of the genetic code itself, this actual system, they would have been disappointed.
I said earlier I was going to get a few bits on the table. I think here is a good place to put it. So if you are a theist listening that's, not someone who's on board with evolution, then what I'm about to explain might explain or give detail of why I took the approach that I did. Consider this, right? If we define language as to be a product of intelligent design, it follows that if DNA is a language, then DNA is necessarily a product of intelligent design. Yeah. We can put this into the deductive form of modus ponens. We can say, which is, by the way, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. So, if there is a language, P, then there is an intelligent designer, Q. DNA is a language, P, therefore an intelligent designer exists, Q. Now, technically, it might be the case that this designer created the language of DNA and then no longer exists, but hopefully you get the point here. Mm-hmm. Now, in my experience, this is what the vast majority of theists are actually arguing, and this is especially true when you're looking at the likes of Ken Ham and Hovland. Like this is the way that they argue. They define language as to presuppose intelligence. It's something that we've touched upon a little bit earlier on. My question to you, John, is that your experience as well? Do you find that is the most prominent horn that's taken here? They define language as to presuppose intelligent design, or do you find that's not the case?
No, I find that is the case. And so I was talking about this with Richard Dawkins as well. My instinct, and this is his too, is instead of trying to say that DNA is not language, or that the genetic code is not language or coding system, instead just focus on the fact that, well, yeah, it is a coding system. It does have linguistic properties, but guess what? We know how those sorts of things evolve. Editor's note. My conversation with Richard Dawkins was actually a little bit different. We were talking about the claim that the genetic code really is a code, like the code that's found in computers, and how the atheist movement has been arguing that that's actually not the case, that the genetic code is only an analogy to code. The following is Richard's response to his fellow atheists.
No, I think that's the wrong approach. I think it is a code, it's definitely a code, and it is a code that's put together not by a designer, but by natural selection. It's very easy to see how that can happen in principle. Details, of course, need to be worked out. But nevertheless, there is no problem in saying that DNA would be a code in just the same kind of way as a computer code. It certainly is a code. You can read it as a code. You could even transcribe. I think I put this in River Out of Eden. You could even transcribe a book into DNA letters.
Now, the argument I'm setting out here with Stephen is different. I'm saying that it's okay to call the genetic code language, but, well, you'll hear my reasoning here.
So I'd like to play a couple of clips. And the first clip it's from a video titled Science Confirms the Bible. And it's from everyone's favorite Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham. So we'll play that, and then I'll give you a few comments.
And you know one of the things that we found out? Languages only ever come from an intelligence, and information only ever comes from information. DNA cries out that there's an intelligence behind life. It couldn't have happened by chance random processes. Matter on its own could never produce DNA. But if life evolved, matter had to produce DNA. But that could never happen.
So Ham's statement of languages only ever come from intelligence, that's a direct quote, it translates to languages, P, implies an intelligent designer, Q. Given this, would you agree with me in saying that according to this definition, DNA is not one?
Yes, I agree with you. You are correct that if we are going to define language as something that only comes from a human mind or a human-like mind, then yeah, the genetic code obviously is not that. And I also agree with you that a lot of people define language in that way. That's kind of casually how we think of language. But what we have discovered in biology over the past several hundred years is that language systems, language-like systems, can emerge naturally.
Yeah, I mean, like another way of putting this with his argument is that effectively the conclusion of intelligent design is presupposed by the premise, by the definition of language that he's using. And thus the argument is just begging the question. That one premise does all of the work on its own. But what you said there is that you'd have to deny the premise, and that means you're focusing on the premise that I focused on. So you would have to focus on the premise that I focused on, because you don't get to define their arguments and their language for them. You have to meet people where they're at. And if people like Ken Ham are explicitly using definitions of languages that presuppose intelligent design, then maybe I'm missing something. But it seems to me that with that type of creationist, with that type of argument, it is correct to focus on that premise, as much as it irritates you or it irritates everyone else, because they are effectively forcing us to throw away all the lovely properties of DNA. And it seems to me that it is correct to focus on that premise. Do you think I'm wrong on that? Because I want to make sure that we're clear on that.
I think, okay, if you're having a conversation with someone who's willing to listen to you, I don't think Ken Ham is that type of person, but
No.
In my observations of his behavior in the past. But if you are having a conversation with someone who's willing to listen to you, I think it's great to say, look, you are correct in being like wooed and awed by the fact that the genetic code has linguistic properties. That is a correct emotion to have. However, the idea that languages only come from minds is simply false.
Yeah.
These same properties can come about in another way. We now know this. We didn't know this 100 years ago, but we do know this now.
So that would translate to you saying to them, you please rephrase your first premise. Your first premise is incorrect. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So,
yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that I didn't get that part of the argument wrong, which is good. But I totally accept that I absolutely should have touched on the other horn. The second clip I want to play, and it's just one more to give an instance of what I'm the tree I'm barking up here, is from John Lennox. John Lennox is seen as an apologist that's a bit more on the C.S. Lewis side. He's a bit more softer. He speaks through narrative and story. But we'll play the clip here, and then I'll extrapolate from his words the exact same argument as Ken Ham.
But you see, there's one area where the simple to the complex explanation does not work. And that is the area where language is involved. If you see your name written on Long Beach or something, 4 or 5 letters of your name, you infer immediately upwards to an intelligent input. No matter what mechanism put that there, you do that. Now, the fascinating thing, and I often suggest it to my fellow professors, I say, look, you go into your laboratory and you see the DNA with 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. And I ask you, what's the origin of that? And you say, chance and necessity. When you'll see anything with language on it, 4 or 5 letters, and immediately you say intelligent input.
All right, so it's harder to spot Lennox's premises, right? But since his argument, and the reason it's harder is because he shrouds his argument in narrative and story. I don't think he does it with bad intent. It's just the way that he speaks, right? You see this with a lot of apologists as well. They do just speak like this. We're a narrative-driven species, right? So we're gonna do better with analogy and story rather than hard, cold logic. But when he says, if you see your name written on a Long Beach or something, 4 or 5 letters of your name, you infer immediately upwards to an intelligent input. He is expressing that if you see a language, P, then this implies intelligent design, Q. Lennox's argument is the same as Ken Ham's, it's just veiled in a humble clothing. So just want to emphasize that when it comes to Ken Ham, John Lennox, and I think, as you agree, most creationists or most anti-Evo boys and girls, it is coming down to the fact that they're defining language in a way that DNA. We can't say that DNA is a language according to that, because if you do, that's your entire argument done. You just need that premise. You don't need any other premises, right? So it's begging the question, and the whole emphasis here is meant to be on, does the DNA require an intelligent creator? And like the science is saying, no, it doesn't. But if you grant the definition that they're using, which is effectively the first premise, then we're over with. That's where the entire battle is fought. So I just wanted to get this all on the table, and hopefully that better explains to the person who reached out to you, I forget his name, where he made a response to me.
Sygart. Yeah.
I hope that gives him a good response, and I imagine he gets frustrated with it as well. I know I would be if you're trying to focus on, no, listen, like this is a really complex and really interesting thing, and yet the story is being pushed towards one side. So, Sai, if you want to understand why atheists have been saying what I've been saying in the past, I would consider the fact that it might be that we're applying to the majority of creationists, and you're not the majority.
Yeah. So I did a debate with T-Jump about this too, and he was making he basically made the same argument. He said that this is what creationists mean when they say it. So he was fighting against what he thinks creationists mean when they say that the genetic code is language. But the big argument that I'm trying to make is that we don't need to just let them get away with defining language as having to come from an intelligent mind. We can just stop and say, look, languages don't have to come from an intelligent mind. That's where the error is in the creationist thinking. We know of another way they can come about.
So when you really think about it, and you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, like I know we've spoken about this before, but you had William Paley and the teleological argument that was saying, look, if you're walking along and you find a watch on the beach, you infer immediately that it was made by intelligence. What was effectively being said there is, look at the human hand, look at the human eye, look at the complexity, look at how perfectly formed it is to work in the way that it does. This screams out for intelligent design. And what happened is with the voyage of, the Beagle, and with Darwin and the subsequent discoveries that we've made, we've got to the point where we actually know exactly how this is made, right? And that is by natural selection, and the evidence for it is utterly overwhelming. These days, most Christians accept natural selection, they accept evolution, so, brilliant, right? You can have this as part of God's mechanism for how he created species. That comes with different problems, but you get the point. But the main takeaway here is that we could not figure out how this stuff was made. It's incredibly complex. And what we did is a God of the gaps. It's the biological, teleological God of the gaps. We said, therefore, God must have done it. Then natural selection occurs, and we figure out, no, this could be explained by natural selection. And subsequently, we've learned that it almost certainly is described by and did come about by natural selection. And what happens now is we go back a stage. The God of the gaps retreats. And the next retreat is the code itself, where you have this language, as you say, where there is these communications between symbols and interpretations from different parts of biology. And this is where the argument is exactly the same, because you look at John Lennox there. He's even talking about seeing a message in the sand. May as well be a watch. It's the same thing. And to me, all I would say is that, look, if you're a theist, please just recognize that this argument was upheld for a very, very long time, and was upheld to be absolutely solidly the case. And now that we've learned the lesson that it was wrong, if there's any takeaway, it's not to make that mistake again. And I would say that alone is a very good argument not to be doing this with the genetic code, because once we discover how that's figured out, I mean, you can still have that as part of a theological story. In fact, I don't really know what else they're paying in terms of ontology there. They've already paid the high price of accepting natural selection, which, comes with a big burden of the problem of evil. So, but yeah, I don't want to rant too much, but it is the same thing. Yeah,
I agree. It's the same thing. And my argument to atheists that are making the genetic code is not really a language, or it's not really a code argument, is that if we were to talk about Paley's watch, if the argument were things as complicated as watches are only created by intelligent minds, the human body is more complicated than a watch, therefore the human body was created by an intelligence, you would easily know which premise is the stupid one there, right? It's obviously the one is that we actually know of another way that complex things can be produced. It's that first premise that's wrong. Human minds can make watches, but also natural selection can make things as complex and more complex than watches. And so that's what I'm trying to convince the atheist movement to start doing, is like, look, if you want to make this argument, argue about the idea that language only comes from thinking minds. That's not true. The thing about the watch, Paley's watch, is that your intuition does tell you that this was created by another person, because we are people and we create things all the time. And when you see a system with linguistic properties at the very heart of biology, the genetic code, when you see that, if you don't know better, it does make you want to say, what the heck? How did a language get inside of our cells? That's weird. But once you understand how it works, it's mind-blowing and it's amazing. So that's what I want to talk about here.
Yeah, that's it's very interesting. I've noticed that compared to most people, I don't have that intuition. So Hume made a really good point on the teleological argument. He said, look, if we was to find a watch, it is not the case that you think that the way that you infer that is a product of intelligent design is because we have every single example of those watches being made by humans. Right. We have 0 examples of them emerging naturally. But when you look at something in nature, I mean, how many people do you know? How many things do you know that have made biological structures? None.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like that intuition doesn't have to always come, but for a lot of people it does.
Oh, I'd say for most, I think you're right. Most people have that intuition.
Yeah, which is why the watch argument was so successful. For so long.
Well, a bit of trivia. I actually think that the William Paley's watchmaker analogy is found in Cicero as well, and a few others. I actually think it's the best argument theists have ever had, and I think that if I lived before Darwin, it's the argument that might have got me there. Yeah. However, you can look at the works of people such as Percy Bysshe Shelley. He's got an amazing essay titled A Refutation of Deism. If you haven't read it, read it. It's phenomenal. He preempted natural selection, and it's just pure magic. He is himself an argument for God.
The existence of that rebuttal is too good to not have come from a God.
That's the one. Funny. That's the one.
Okay. When people are talking, we actually conflate languages and messages written in languages all the time. It's as common as saying that the sun rose. You know, the sun doesn't actually rise; the earth spins. Right? We all know that, and a lot of times we'll do this when we're talking about languages as well. So here I'm saying, "Hey, look, I wrote English," and I've got Queen Elizabeth here saying, "No, you used English to send a written message to English readers." Another example of this is I wrote JavaScript, and I'm showing off some JavaScript that I wrote here. And then Brendan Ike, the guy who actually wrote JavaScript, is saying, no, you use JavaScript to send a message to a browser. So if we want to be really careful in how we're using our word, we don't talk about the human's genetic codes for blah, blah, blah. We would say that the sequence of the human genome codes for certain proteins, because the genetic code itself is the language, and then the actual gene sequences that we have, those are specific messages using the language of the genetic code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm getting your drift there, and you're right. Like, people do this so often, and I'm one of them.
If you look at most textbooks, even like biology textbooks, they'll confuse a sequence of DNA with code. They'll call it code, and I've done it in some of my videos too. It's just kind of like the looseness of language that we use.
Yeah, totally.
There are 3 really cool discoveries that have been made in the 20th century, or really they kind of blossomed in the 20th century. People were making discoveries along these lines even earlier, but one of them is that symbol or signal-based communication systems are everywhere in biology, and thinking minds are not required to operate them. So what I mean by that is languages. They're everywhere in biology. You don't need a thinking mind to operate them. Here's an example. These flowers are signaling systems. They are sending signals to pollinators to attract them over. They're essentially saying, I've got nectar, come get it. That's what the insect is interpreting. What the flower thinks it's saying is, come pollinate me. The sender and the receiver actually understand slightly different things, but the end goal ends up being the same. The pollinator gets nectar, which is what they're after, And by accident, they also pollinate this flower because they're going to all the different species of the same flower to get the nectar that they just got from this one. So they end up pollinating. The color of those flowers, that didn't emerge randomly. That's the reason that exists is because it was selected for. It did emerge randomly, but it was selected to stay and to accumulate in its ability to transmit that color to further and further distances by making that color brighter and brighter, because it was increasing that plant's ability to survive and reproduce. So there's real signaling happening here. That's why those flowers exist. They are signaling structures.
One of the things I've noticed with people that are skeptical of evolution is they tend to think that you would need the new information to be something very, very dramatic, and then it gets selected to stay, right? Whereas actually it only needs to be very, very subtle, and then you just get like an evolutionary arms race until you get something that's very, very complex. And I found that when I was learning evolution, when I was younger, that was one of the harder things to get my head around, and it took like a few core examples to figure out how that works to get my head around it. But I wanted to emphasize that and a couple of other things here, and that is that in biology, is a symbol and a signal synonymous, or are they different?
In biology, we use the term signal, where in semiotics, you might call it a symbol. There's actually a bunch of different words for it. We are cue detecting entities. Like I can detect when, like, my wife gets home from work. Like she's not telling me necessarily that she got home from work, but I hear her open the door and she comes into the house, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm just picking up on cues. My dogs can pick up on cues too. Like if we start packing bags for vacation, they get super upset because they know what's coming. They know that we're going to leave them at someone else's house and they're not going to see us for a while.
So would you say that that's a cue? Because
that is
it's not
cue
something
detection.
you're in. Yeah, because you're not intending to convey that information to your dogs, but they pick up that cue. And like you haven't evolved to communicate that, and you're not deliberately trying to communicate like you're not trying to communicate that at all. But that's what the dogs will pick up. So it's a cue. Whereas a signal would be something that it's deliberate in the definition of it being selected for, like it's got like a purpose in that sense, or just deliberate in a conscious sense. If you're like talking about languages such as English and things like that.
Yeah, the word deliberate is something that a lot of people don't really like to use with signaling. Because, I mean, you could say that the flower is deliberately broadcasting a message to pollinators, but it's a little bit weird to say that it's doing that deliberately because it doesn't have a brain, and we want to associate intentions with brains because that's maybe because we're selfish and we like to think that we're special. But the plant obviously doesn't have a brain.
No.
You can definitely say that it's actively transmitting this signal and that it evolved to do that. There's this adaptive definition of signaling in biology. In order for it to be called a signal, both of the players in the communication have to be benefiting evolutionarily for participating in the communication. If the sender only benefits and the receiver, it changes its behavior but then hurts itself by doing so, we call that coercion. We don't even call that signaling.
Okay.
So that there is a flower that's coercive. It pretends it sends out sex hormones.
Yeah.
It sends out sex hormones so a bee will come hump it. It doesn't get any nectar, nothing. It thinks that it's mating with a female. That's not called signaling, that's called coercion.
So would coercion also count as these bright frogs, which they essentially want to get eaten so that they kill the predators in the area due to them being poisonous, thus allowing the rest of the frogs to survive? Would that count as? There's
a misunderstanding there on how we think that evolves that might be too far of a tangent. We think that in most cases what's happening is an animal will evolve a toxin, so it does make predators sick. The predator is maybe not dying, but it's like, I do not want to eat that again. They just have a horrible time. And so they're remembering something that they noticed about the animal. And if it was a slight red tint or something, they're going to remember that. And they're going to be super cautious for anything with a red tint. And what that does is once you have enough predators that are scared of a red tint, now there is selection pressure to be red. And if you're red, you don't get eaten. And the more red you are, the less often you get confused for something that's food, and the less often you die. So you have this new selection pressure to become bright red. It requires enough of the predators to either have learned that you're not good to eat or to have evolved a phobia of you. It's way slower, but you can evolve a phobia as well as learn to be afraid of a certain cue. In most cases, we think that this starts out as a cue detection on the predator side, and then the prey item ends up adapting, evolving, and it really is a signal, because the prey item doesn't want to get eaten, and the predator doesn't want to eat a toxic prey item. So it's actually, that is a signal. Both organisms are benefiting in that communication.
Brilliant.
There are other ways that can evolve, that we can imagine that can evolve, and it's probably evolved in different ways in different times, but it's not coercive because both of them are benefiting. Both of them have an evolutionary benefit for not engaging in that fight.
Yeah.
So communication systems, they're everywhere in nature, and I'll even show more of those. I'll do a deep dive into that here in a minute, but the other point that I want to make is that communication systems can emerge naturally. Thinking minds are not required to design them, and this is very counterintuitive at first, but it becomes really clear when you look at all the research that's been done on this. Here we have some E. coli, and E. coli have quite complex communication systems. They coordinate their behaviors with each other, and these communication molecules, these symbols that they excrete and detect from each other, these evolved under selection pressure to cooperate. That's how this communication system emerged within bacteria. And then the third thing that I want to drive home is that the genetic code really is a simple language. It has these linguistic properties. Compared to English, it's incredibly simple. Some linguists will be like, okay, I'm okay with you calling it a language if you make sure to point out that it's extremely simple compared to English. Some linguists might say that, because linguists study human language, some of them might say, I'd rather you just say that it has linguistic properties. But it really does have linguistic properties. And more specifically, the genetic code is a signal-based communication system.
Yep.
You actually had a definition of language in your video. There's 3 issues that I have with this statement. You say that language is the exchange of information from one entity to another through mutually understood signs. And DNA, my friends, isn't that. Of course, I take issue with the fact that you say it isn't that, because I say it is. I also take slight issue with saying DNA here, because it's actually the genetic code. DNA is one component in this system. There's multiple parts that are actually not DNA. To say that DNA is the language is like saying that mouth noises are English. It's people say it all the time. They say that DNA is code or DNA is language, and I get what they're saying. I don't take major issue with it, but it's a little bit weird to say. And then you said mutually understood signs here, again, because a cell doesn't have a brain, and understood is something that we associate with brains. I would change it to just say that there are established signs. So they've been established in advance. That's what allows communication to happen.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that I think that's one of the biggest, if not the biggest blunder I think I made in the video. So yeah, fair enough, man. Fair play. So
we do have 2 entities here that are communicating with each other. The sending entity is the genome, so that's where the DNA is. The actual message is messenger RNA, so it's a protein coding chain of RNA, and the actual symbols in that are what we call codons, and I'll talk about what codons are later. The interpreting entity, the thing that does the interpretation, is the ribosome, and the meaning of a particular message is a finished protein, so a specific type of protein. The genome and the ribosome are communicating with each other, and what are they communicating about? They're communicating about proteins. They're trying to build these proteins. So let's dive in here to the meat and potatoes of this first claim, that symbol or signal-based languages, these communication systems, they are everywhere in biology. Thinking minds are not required to operate them. And first, a little jargon side note, we kind of covered some of this already, but there's a bunch of different fields that deal with languages and codes, and they define terms slightly differently and for important reasons based on important arguments that happened in those fields in the past. Linguists study human languages. That's their focus. So when there's anything simpler than human languages that people want to talk about as language, they'll get a little bit agitated. Like if you say that Coco the gorilla is using language, they're like, okay, Coco the gorilla was using a really simplified version of sign language, but most of the syntax that we have in sign language, she completely didn't understand. She ignored. I don't want to call that human language for sure.
Yeah.
She was definitely using symbols, though, a linguistic property.
Yeah.
Computer scientists, they study machine and programming languages. Some of them are as complex as English, I would say. Probably get up there. Then you have biologists and ethologists. So famous ethologists would be Jane Goodall, Richard Dawkins. They studied signaling in animals. A lot of people don't know this. That was actually Dawkins' thing is he studied signaling. He actually made really big contributions to the field of animal signaling.
Did his selfish gene make like, how does signaling work with the selfish gene? You know, you got like bees, which they're not trying to preserve themselves as in an individual, they're trying to preserve their hive, because the hive has their DNA, and so you have this evolutionary pressure to be able to, you know, basically kill themselves in order to preserve their own genes, which is in their kin. I would imagine signaling has something, it can be put into the language that's happening there.
When a bee is enraged, one of the things that causes a bee to get enraged is the ripping apart of another bee. If you injure another bee, there are molecules that are sent out from that bee's body that stimulates a rage response in other bees. It's a very automatic thing. They've evolved to do that. So it is signaling. They're receiving a signal that there's been a death, and it causes them to go into fight mode. So yeah, it does fit that way. Richard Dawkins, he was mainly studying signals in animals. Like, I think he mostly focused on birds, I want to say. He didn't really talk about that much in like the selfish gene. The selfish gene was just him summarizing other people's work, basically. But his actual contributions to the primary scientific literature, a lot of it was in signaling, how it is that communication happens between animals. So that is a very important field of biology. It's become a very important field of biology. And they define terms very specifically. We already mentioned how before we consider it a signal, it has to be shown to be adaptive for both the sender and the receiver. Otherwise, we call it a cue, or we call it a coercion. And then you have semioticians, so semiotics. This is the study of the meaning of signs, and they'll study man-made signs that you'd have in human languages. They'll study, signaling in animals, anything. It doesn't matter. They're really interested in the meanings of signs. They actually don't use the word language very much. They talk about codes. So they would actually consider English to be a code, a really complex coding system. You've got encoding and decoding. So, of course, there's ways to make an argument that the genetic code is not language. There's so many different definitions of language to choose from that you're guaranteed to find one. Sure.
This is it. Yeah, I was like, with those 4 that you've got there, am I right in saying that the first 2 presuppose in an intelligent creator, or at least a mind that's part of the process? So you got like human languages, and like these things have evolved where I'm using words that you're processing in your brain, right? I'm intelligently trying to give it to you, and you are intelligently interpreting it. And then when it comes to computers, although you can set up an algorithm and you can have it so it's running without any kind of intelligent input, what's interesting here is that you do need, well, I don't know if you need, maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong here, like this would be good, but it seems to me that you need the initial state to be set up by someone that knows what they're doing, which is kind of like the argument that's being put across now, right? They think that that's the equivalent of what's happened with DNA, and that for some reason they think that an all-powerful, all-loving God has selected for DNA, which absolutely ends up with really nasty mistakes. Like, evolution is a wonderful process and everything, but it is disgustingly brutal. I think Sam Harris was saying that evolution, if it was designed by God, it is a system that would embarrass a psychopath in every single way. It's an incredibly nasty process. So so these first 2 linguists are studying human language. The interesting thing about human language is that it actually wasn't invented by anybody. It was languages emerge within a culture. There was no one who sat down and designed English. That never happened. I guess one of the arguments that you got most in trouble for on your videos was there's this big debate right now. We have a splitting of words right now between sex and gender. We're seeing the evolution of English language right before our very eyes with this fight that's going on between how should we define male and female, man and woman. That it's super interesting from an evolutionary perspective and from a linguist perspective. Like, we're watching language change right before our very eyes, and it's super cool, I think.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
In this case, it's there's a lot of kicking and screaming as it's happening. Like, people don't want the language to change.
Yeah.
It is amazing, isn't it? It's like you look at words such as awesome, and because it's not imbued in a political context, it just changes regularly, right?
Right.
We say, oh, that's terrible. We mean it's good. So it's like these words have just completely went from top to bottom.
Yeah.
But because, as you were saying, like man and woman is in a political landscape, you've got it so that there's sophistry and rhetoric applied so that one side will just go, no, it must be defined as a woman is a biological female. And then you've got the other side saying, if you don't agree with my definition, you're automatically bigoted. And it's amazing. Right. As you said, it is amazing. As a biologist or a sociologist, it must be a very interesting thing to be watching. It's amazing how just language, well, it just is the be-all and end-all of so many arguments in philosophy and science, ethics, politics, and as we said, we're focusing a lot on the definition of language itself. Right. It really does illustrate that point.
Human languages definitely emerged, and we use brains to process them. Machine languages, you can find the person, a lot of them are still alive, that actually invented specific machine languages or programming languages. Like the guy who invented JavaScript, for example, which is a programming language, he's still around. You can go talk to him and buy him coffee if you want. So creationists might see that and be like, oh, well, you can go meet the guy. He's the modern person, and the original person was Jesus or whatever. So
you got to get the Jesus JavaScript argument.
Yeah. So it makes sense that people are trying to make this argument, or that this thought occurs to them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually worked with a linguist to come up with this kind of all-encompassing definition for language, code, communication system. Shout out to Stefan Hurtubise. He's the linguist out in Montreal that helped me on this. So a language is a set of symbols, their meanings, and syntax rules allowing one entity to transmit messages to another. And according to him, he said any linguist would see that and be like, okay, yeah, that's good. They might want to specify that it doesn't really count as language unless a human is speaking it. But he said that's, if they understand you're going for a general thing, that yes, they're going to be perfectly happy with this. And someone who designed programming languages or machine languages would also be happy with this, because when I press a key on my keyboard is transmitting a message to my computer that my computer is interpreting. There is a sender and a receiver. There is a set of symbols, which in this case is binary. We're covering all the bases here. And this really does cover what's special about the genetic code, is the genetic code is this as well. And then a symbol in some fields is called a signal or a sign or a code point or a codon. This is a thing which arbitrarily represents another thing within a specific language, but is not that thing.
I am cool with these. I have been calmly educated, and I am very, very grateful on this fact. No, seriously, I'm cool.
Another way to think of a signal or a symbol is like why? Like what's the point of encoding something into some sort of a signal? A signal is any easily transmittable thing, so a sound or a color or a gesture or a molecule or an electric pulse, in the case of a computer, which represents another thing that cannot be transmitted as efficiently. So if we just look at English, in the English language, I'm the sender, you're the receiver. The symbol that I'm using here is apple. That is a physical thing. I'm sending a sound vibration to you, which is a physical thing. It's easier for me to transmit that sound vibration than to actually transmit an apple to you, right?
Yep.
But you interpret that as meaning an apple. One of the neat properties about language, and this is also true of the genetic code, is that it's possible that you don't speak the same language as me, and so when I try to communicate with you, there's going to be miscommunication. If I say pomme, which is French for apple, and you don't speak French, communication has failed. And this is a very special property of languages. We can find this in the genetic code as well.
So how does that relate to cues?
In a cue, the sender isn't trying to communicate with the receiver. The sender is just going about his daily business. I used to be in Boy Scouts growing up, and we were camping in an area that had black bears, and black bears will run away from humans. They're scared of humans. But if you surprise one, it'll kill you, right? Because if it doesn't notice you and all of a sudden you're in its face, it'll fight you. If you're walking, it's going to hear your footsteps and run away. That's cue detection, right? It's detecting transmissions that you're making, but you're not making those transmissions so that the bear will hear it. We were taught that we should be loud when we're walking through the woods and talk loudly. And if we're not talking, we should sing a song or hum a song. That way the bear will be sure to hear us and make sure to run away way before we come in contact with it. We were told to transform our cue into a signal, to actively magnify it. We knew how this bear would respond, and so we magnified our cue. by magnifying that cue, we turn it into a signal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example.
Okay, so everybody pretty much gets human language, right? There's no one's confused that English is a language. No one's confused that French is a language. The wolf pheromone signaling system is actually a communication system. So a female wolf, when she's in estrus, she'll produce this molecule in her urine. It's methyl P hydroxybenzoate. And that molecule is unique to wolves. And it's unique to wolves that are in estrus. And it's excreted into their urine. And if a male wolf picks that up, they interpret that meaning as, there's mating to be had here. And the reason that we say that that is a signal, not just a cue, is that if you watch a female wolf, it doesn't just happen to be a byproduct that her body makes when she's in estrus. She's actively transmitting it. She marks all over the place, and she marks as high as possible on trees and so on, so that that signal gets wafted as far and as wide as possible. She's actively transmitting that. There are also other reasons to suspect that this isn't just an accidental byproduct of being in estrus, this molecule. It's actually an evolved signal, because if you look at closely related species, they have slight tweaks to these molecules, or at least to the concentrations of them that are produced, that makes it so that there's not confusion between species. So if a fox gets this same whiff of the same urine, he's not going to be confused and think that there's a mate. He's just not going to know what it is. It's not going to make any sense to him. There is an evolved signaling system that's happened here. Other wolves understand it. They've evolved to understand it. Even other canids don't understand it. Foxes don't understand the wolf's mating signals in their urine. This is quite obviously a signal.
And with her actively doing it, sorry to interrupt, but with her actively doing it, that's not necessarily emphasizing that she's conscious of doing it. It's just a process for her.
Yeah, she might be. We don't know. I mean, we don't know how much of her brain is involved in this. I mean, obviously she doesn't know the chemical structure of the thing that she's emitting in her urine.
And you could always just extract this out, right? So insects communicate with pheromones a lot, and I would presume that they probably don't have consciousness. So, you would, but it's still a signal for the reasons that you put out before, like when the bee, there's a signal that's transmitted. I mean, you can't be deliberately sending out a sign because it's dead, with the bee example, but it's still a signal.
Yeah, you have these systems, and again, the neat property of them. One neat thing to point out is that if you don't speak the language, there's no communication that happens. So if the interpreter doesn't understand that language, there's no communication. And I say understand in a general sense. So you don't need a brain necessarily, but if you're not set up, if the signal hasn't been established for you, there's no communication. Another one that definitely doesn't use a brain is the human endocrine system. So testicles produce testosterone, and that gets sent all through the bloodstream. And there's a bunch of cells that have testosterone receptors. We call them androgen receptors. And when those receptors, which are very special proteins, when they bump into a testosterone molecule, they bind to it. It changes their shape. They're able to enter the nucleus of the cell and then bind to it specific genes. And it's different depending on the cell type, which ones are available. And then those genes will cause the cell to behave differently. And so here we have your testicles are talking to your face. They're sending messages to your face if there's testosterone, and if you have the androgen receptors in your face, you can grow a beard. So that's the meaning, like grow a beard. It's kind of funny, like a lot of us then shave them afterwards. And also I should point out that some lineages actually can't grow beards because they don't have those androgen receptors in the face aren't there. A lot of people will talk about like Native Americans either really thin beards or sometimes no beards at all. And it's because they haven't evolved the androgen receptors in the face in the same pattern that Europeans do. They don't grow the same types of beards.
So considering that we are descended from, other apes and, chimpanzees, mammals, etc. Well, we are a mammal. Would it be actually that they've had a selection process to no longer grow it on the face, just as every human's basically had a selection not to grow it, near the eyes and stuff? Like, is it that way round?
It's actually not clear. I don't know that lineage-specific beard patterns have been studied all that well. It would be super interesting, though, because I think it's super interesting. I mean, Darwin actually spent a lot of time speculating about why we have beards. He thinks it was sexual selection.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone has a little bit of facial hair. Females tend not to have it, and males tend to have it because it's testosterone that's the signal for it. There are other ways to stimulate hair growth too, aside from testosterone. But
talking of interesting things, one of the ways that the word woman has been one of the reasons it's being redefined relates to actually something similar to this, and that is that if you have a condition called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, it means that your body can't synthesize the testosterone. And consequently, you won't grow like the beard, even if you do have it in you.
Okay, super small correction. People with androgen insensitivity syndrome actually, they can produce testosterone. They just can't receive it. So it's like I'm speaking French just fine, but you don't speak French, and so there's miscommunication.
My apologies. No, thank you for correcting me. So you have that condition, and it's amazing that males present completely as females, right? Because they grow breasts, they don't grow as tall, they get wide hips. Like, for most of human history, males were identified that had this condition as women, and it's like that's one of the arguments that's been put through to say actually we're wrong on the way that we're looking at man and woman, similar to how when we found the what's that mammal that just absolutely messes up everything? The platypus, right? You find the platypus and you go, all right, now we have to go look at our definitions again because this changes things up. It just reminded me of that, and I thought I'd chuck it on there since you're mentioning.
There's actually so many weird exceptions for sex differences among animals that evolutionary biologists try to define male and female by what type of gamete you produce. So if you produce egg cells, they want to say that you're female. If you produce sperm cells, they want to say that you're male. But they're not doing that in a medical sense for humans. They're doing it for all of biology because there's so many different organisms that are hermaphroditic, for example. They produce egg cells and sperm cells. In the human case, because we're not trying to find a general rule for all organisms, it's perfectly reasonable that we have much more nuance when we're talking about humans. So someone with androgen insensitivity, they actually produce sperm cells. They don't produce egg cells.
Yeah, and it's like if you define sex by gamete type, which has been what I've understood biologists tend to do, spoken to a few because of the background that I had. If you define it by gamete type, then in that case, they are male, end off. But it just shows how culture had the wrong idea of thinking that a man necessarily means male. It's like, no, man doesn't necessarily mean that. It's just interesting stuff.
Another little editor's note here. This picture, which I grabbed from Wikipedia, is of a bunch of women with androgen insensitivity syndrome. So actually some of them are intersex in other ways. But so these women have XY chromosomes that can produce sperm. Well, they can sort of produce sperm. The sperm aren't actually viable in people with complete androgen insensitivity. But obviously, for a lot of people, it seems counterintuitive to consider these people men. Now, here on the right, I've got blurred out a photo right now. I'm going to show it to you. If you are uncomfortable with nudity, I suggest that you pause this video, go talk to a psychologist or something, because it's just the human body. This woman is actually, she produces sperm. She is XY. This is what complete androgen insensitivity syndrome looks like. Not only would you not know that she's, according to some definitions, a male, in many cases she wouldn't know. And, she might get married and have a heterosexual relationship with a man and everything totally fine, except for that she would be infertile. It's a pretty rare condition, but it's not some sort of crazy extremist anti-science statement to say that the definition that evolutionary biologists use for male and female, it honestly doesn't capture all of the things that most folks care about when they talk about men, women, males, and females. So the interesting thing about these signals here is that the sender can miscommunicate. So you could have a disorder where you're not producing testosterone appropriately, and that can cause men to start growing breasts, for example. Or you can have the interpreter can have an error. So in androgen insensitivity, the interpreter is got a mutation that breaks it. It can't really grab onto testosterone properly. And so the other property of languages is you can have miscommunication from the sender and from the receiver. And you can also have interference where the actual signal can get intercepted by something in between too. All of these beautiful linguistic properties exist in the endocrine system. They exist in these pheromone systems and so on. again, if there's hair follicle cells without androgen receptors, that testosterone enters the cell and it's just some noise in the cell. It means nothing. Anything can be used as a symbol in a communication system. We talked about urinating already. It can be tactile signals, visual, chemical, audible, whatever. So this dog is actively communicating. He's not just peeing, he's peeing as high as he can. He's trying to announce his presence, right? Mm. The flower is using visual signals to communicate. They've also got a bunch of chemical signals, fragrances that they're emitting as well. These ants are using tactile and chemical signaling. They can sense molecules on each other, and they're also just touching each other in the right ways, so they know that they're the same species. And they might be actually sending other information here too, like where to go and find food and so on. Signaling can happen between members of the same species. I think this group is called, they're butterfly fish, and they're actually signaling what species they are to other butterfly fish because they eat very specific types of food. And so if there's more than one of the same type of butterfly fish on the same chunk of rock, they're going to end up fighting. So this is basically advertisement. If you're one of me, don't come here. I will fight you. So they can see this from a long distance away, and they know I'm not going to bother risking my life to swim from this area all the way to that area in the open water to just go fight some dude that's already there. So they're signaling with these colors. We can see this by looking at the color differences between different species and then using genetics to see how closely related they are, how distantly related they are. And we find that it's being in direct proximity to someone who's actually not a threat that triggers natural selection to start selecting for a difference in coloration patterns. So you get this crazy rainbow of colors from species to species. They're signaling.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. It's do you know if their color at all comes from their food? I think with like bioluminescence, some creatures have got that because they eat food that is bioluminescent.
In this case, I don't think that's. I'm pretty sure I could be wrong. There's always individual little exceptions, but
yeah, fair enough.
These pigments that they're making, I believe they synthesize themselves. Basically, everything that makes you go whoa when you're outside, that's a signal. Like the song of a bird, the color, crazy color of a fish. Those are signals. We just don't understand what they mean, so they look crazy and beautiful to us. The feathers of a peacock, it's signaling to females that it's healthy enough to grow this crazy thing. And it also uses this to threaten predators. Like a predator comes to it, it's got all these eyes that are staring at it. The predator's like, what the heck is this? It's actually a misnomer to say that this just evolved to impress females. Here we have what's called stodding. A lot of antelope species will do this. They will jump vertically really high when they see a predator. And this is signaling a couple things. It's signaling that the predator now knows that it's been spotted because they do this when there's a predator around. So it's like, crap, if I needed to surprise this animal to catch it, my cover's blown.
Yeah.
We think that this evolved because when you're running in a herd away from a predator, if a predator is chasing an entire herd, the herd runs slower than individuals can because there's a bunch of animals trying to coordinate their efforts. If you're in the end of that and there's a predator right behind you, you can jump vertically straight up and show that predator how strong you are. So it's like if he singles you out and gets you on a one-on-one chase, he's probably not going to win. So you're able to show how strong you are by jumping straight up in the air, even though you can't move fast forward.
Brilliant.
And so the predator benefits from this. He doesn't want to chase the happiest, healthiest individual. He wants to get the one that's going to be easy dinner, right? So basically by jumping straight up, it's saying, don't eat me, eat the other one. And it's actually a benefit for both the sender and the receiver, which is the predator in this case. It's not a benefit to the other guy that gets that gets eaten. But so this is a form of signaling between predator and prey that happens. And then we have signaling that happens between mutual symbionts. This is a goby and a shrimp. The shrimp is really good at digging, and the goby is really good at spotting food sources. And so the goby will guide the shrimp to food, and the shrimp will maintain the lodge that they both live in. And they have these really complex systems of the way he twitches his tail. They definitely have a complex signaling system between them.
Oh, it's amazing. See, that reminds me of, I think there's a certain tribe in Africa that they have like a similar relationship with birds, where the birds will... They're like call out with whistles, and then the birds will show them where there's honey.
Right.
And then after they go to the tree and they get stung like hell getting this honey out, they break off a bit and give it to the bird.
Right.
And you've just got this relationship, and I don't know how long that's lasted, but that's just like, it reminds me of what you're showing there. It's, this thing is probably not as rare as you might think.
Right. Languages can vary in complexity from a single word, which you wouldn't really want to call it a language, it's just a signal, to many signals. The signaling that happens between plants and pollinators is actually pretty complex. A flower will signal when it has nectar. It'll signal when it's already been pollinated. It doesn't want pollinators to bother it anymore. There's some really complex signaling happening between flowers and pollinators. And we think that flowers, they're aware, not aware mentally, but they change physiologically when they sense the vibration of a bee's wings. They can start generating more nectar if they didn't have very much. And then here we have this red frog. It's a one-word signaling system. It's basically saying, like, I'm toxic, don't mess with me. It's going to be bad for you. We talked about how that could evolve.
Funny enough, that looks like some of the fruit you can get in England, where it's like, even as a kid, I'd look at it and I'd go, I don't want that. Even though I'd go eat the blackberries, but I'd look at the red ones and I'd go, that's not going to go down well. Hey, it turns out it's very poisonous to us. Good that I didn't go for it, but you can tell that was in me installed. If I was going to go Jordan Peterson on you, I'd be like, oh, we got the motif of the redness, and it's that's why the devil's red. That's,
Yeah. I mean, there might be instinctual reasons why we hate certain colors. I mean, we know that this is the case in animals, like they're instinctually afraid of certain colors. Probably in humans, it's a lot more cultural than instinctual, because we've lived in a lot of different environments and been exposed to a lot of different dangers and a lot of different signaling systems. What happens is you'll find that different colors are warning systems in different ecosystems, because that's how it's evolved there. You can have yellows are a lot of times warning signals, and blues, and then reds. Basically anything that's super obvious to see, most predators are going to be cautious. Like, why are you making yourself so obvious? This is weird. And part of that's learned and part of it's instinctual for most predators.
Yeah, like so like the argument of how much of it is cultural, how much of it is natural is obviously a very difficult one to navigate. But one thing that's really fascinated me is there's a lot of sociological, and this is a bit of a tangent, but there's a lot of sociological work that relates to snakes and humans' relationship to snakes.
Right.
And it's like, why do snakes keep coming up in our stories to do with religion, right? So you've got Genesis, and you've got it, why is the devil a snake? Why not a bee, right? I mean, more people in England die from bee stings every year than they do snakes. Like, objectively, empirically, bees are a worse enemy than snakes. But but it's not, a bee wouldn't make sense in that story, whereas a snake has been a very serious predator to mammals for a very, very long time. And so it makes sense why it keeps coming up. But my favorite instance of that was in Norse mythology or Norse religion. To me, they're largely the same thing. It's amazing that their Leviathan, which is the world serpent, is a snake. And it's really? An ectothermic species happens to be the Leviathan in this frozen wasteland. It's funny, but maybe not a coincidence if you take seriously that maybe these things are etched in us.
Oh yeah. We do know that humans have an instinctually fast response, so we can spot snakes faster than almost anything else.
Yeah.
I think we can spot an angry human face faster than a snake in these psychology tests. But other than that, like, snake is number one. We can spot a snake. They'll flash pictures in front of you, and you say when you found the organism. We spot snakes immediately. And the same is true with monkeys. They can do these weird tests where they're actually putting probes in the brain, which is messed up. But for science, I don't even think it's even worth knowing what they learned from this. But they put probes in monkey brains, and they would do the same thing. So you can actually see when it's alarmed.
Yeah.
And
same with snakes. You can drop a cucumber. You drop a cucumber near a snake, it is going to go mental. In most cases.
A cucumber near a snake?
Oh, sorry. Did I say snake? You put a cucumber near a snake, it's not going to do anything. Sorry. Cats, that's the one. Yeah, if you put a cucumber near a cat, it's gonna peg it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm curious with the cucumber thing. If you put anything really weird behind a cat, would it do that? Or is it specifically the cucumber? But
hey, John, it's all for science.
Yeah. Basically, we can see that for signal-based communication to occur, the sender must actively encode information into a transmittable form, so a signal, that the receiver is likely to decode or interpret. And if the receiver interprets that signal correctly, we say that communication has occurred. Biologists would bump that one more degree of complexity and say that both of them have on average, benefit from the communication. It has to be in their selective advantage to participate in this before we actually call it communication. Otherwise, we might call it coercion, right? One organism is coercing another to do something that it shouldn't be doing for its own well-being. That is communication. A thinking mind is not required for that to happen. You can have encoded information. You can have that decoded. A thinking mind is not required to encode and decode a message. Here we have some human-made languages and some non-human languages. You've got English, you've got Morse code on the human side, you've got ASCII code, so the binary that represents the English alphabet. You've got JavaScript, you've got C++, you've got musical notation. These are all things we can talk about as human-invented signaling systems or languages. And then on the non-human side, you've got things like the pheromone signaling in dogs, plant pollinator signaling, quorum sensing in bacteria, the plant mycorrhizal signaling. So this is between plants and fungi. They do a lot of communicating between each other. They have a symbiotic relationship. And then the endocrine system, so the hormone system, and the genetic code. Some of these use brains, some of them do not. When we're talking about dogs and the pheromone signaling system, you can actually argue that they're not using their mind to interpret that so much as their instincts. But again, that's what we think. And then with the plant, you've got a bee which can actually figure things out and do some processing with its brain to understand what it should be doing with this plant. But the plant certainly doesn't have a brain. Simple languages are everywhere in biology. And we're cool with that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So communication systems can emerge naturally. Thinking minds are not required to design them. This, I think, is going to be news to a lot of people, especially to creationists who haven't thought about this. And the problem that they see, and it's an appropriate problem to see, is that before communication works, the meaning of each symbol must be established. The sender and the receiver have to have that meaning established. So how then do languages emerge? How is each symbol's meaning established? And this isn't just a puzzling question for the endocrine system or the genetic code. This is a puzzling system for English. Like we said, no one sat down and invented English. How do we decide what words mean, And how do we decide to change that? Well, in biology, in signaling, we learn that signals come from cues. They start out as cues. My dog and I have a bunch of signals that we use to communicate with each other. And a lot of them started out as cues. So we are both thinking animals, and we're establishing the meanings of these cues with our brains. And not only has she established a bunch of signals with me, she's established a bunch of signals with our other dog. They actually communicate quite a bit. I could spend a bunch of time studying how they communicate with each other, but there's a really interesting signal that developed between Zoe and I. When my wife and I first moved in together, these dogs were hers. With me moving in here, just stirring things up a lot, we would sometimes forget to make sure that the dog's water bowl was full. And I'm working from home, so I'm always here. And right next to my office is the bathtub. And so Zoe would jump in the bathtub when she was thirsty and lick the water off of the bottom of the bathtub. Well, when I realized that, I panicked, oh my gosh, I'm a horrible human. My dog doesn't have water. So the first time I noticed her doing that, I freaked out, and I went and I gave her food and water and treats and attention. It was the best thing ever for her. She's like, wow, for some reason this guy loves it when I jump in the bathtub, So when I do this, he does everything I want. She started doing it all the time. And she realized it's hard for her because she's a little tiny dog to jump into the bathtub. It's easy for her to just put her paws on it and kind of ding around on it. If I just hear her claws on the side of the bathtub, I come just as quickly. And so she eventually stopped jumping in the tub and would just smack the side of the bathtub. And then I'd get up and I'd come and give her rewards. Eventually, she stopped doing it when she needed water. She'd just do it when she wanted attention. And the signal actually broke down because I got better at remembering to give her water. And she kept exploiting this situation. And so the signal eventually broke down and she no longer does it. But for a while, we had this signal going where she would just go into the bathroom. She wouldn't go to me. She would go into the bathroom and make noise on the bathtub, and I would come running. So we had an active signal between us.
Yeah. That's brilliant. I've got a bearded dragon, wonderful creature, incredibly. I don't know how they survived. They don't seem smart, but you judge a fish by how well it can climb a tree, then that's probably what I'm doing.
Right.
But just in relation to that, she will headbutt the glass when she wants to come out. Very simple. potentially there's a bit of, Pavlovian conditioning there where she's going, that is her way to communicate. She knows that when she does that, I'm going to let her out so that she can scat all over the floor. Fair enough.
Right. If you think about what's happening here, it's the same as training. I don't know if you ever trained a dog before, but I gave Zoe a bunch of rewards for doing a particular behavior. That's exactly the same as giving her a treat for laying down or rolling over. The only real difference here is that she was an active part in coming up with that signal too. The cue is turned into a signal when you have two organisms with thinking minds that are motivated to cooperate. They can transform cues into signals. And this is the same, like you can teach your dog what the word sit means, because the dog wants to cooperate to get that food from you. When there's motivation to cooperate, cues turn into signals. That happens. That is natural. It's important to really drive this home that a cue is a passive transmission, a signal is an active transmission, and then if you got one or more established signals, you have a communication system. You could call that a language. It's got linguistic properties. An example of a cue, if a male is in the house and they leave the seat up, they weren't necessarily trying to announce that, hey, a male is here. They probably just forgot to put the seat down after they peed. So that's just a cue. But this dog is actually transmitting, hey, a male is here. That is an active signal that dog is transmitting. I mean, I suppose a male might do this on purpose too, leave the seat up.
Yeah. Well, we've got all the reason to think that the dog is conscious, but is it conscious of that, or is it not? And if it's not conscious of that, then is it a cue, right? Or how does it relate to cue? Because it's interesting. It seems to be the intention here. I mean, maybe you can help me out there. What role does intention play in making a cue a signal?
Intention doesn't have to be a part of it at all. It feels like we want to say intention because we have a dog and the dog has a brain. If we're saying that intentions come from minds, intention doesn't have to be here at all. What has to be here is that it is an adaptation. The dog has evolved to magnify this cue.
Got you.
And because the dog has evolved under selection pressure to magnify this cue, we say that it is now a signal. And I understand that can get tricky because, how do you know that it evolved to do that? We know that the dogs benefit from this communication. It's obvious that they benefit from it. It's how they find mates. So obviously mating is how you win the evolutionary game.
Yeah, whereas leaving the toilet seat up is actually probably a way not to win mates. I don't know many people at all that appreciate it. So,
Right. So any cue can eventually become a signal if it ends up benefiting. I have a twin brother, and we actually had a little language that we had before we learned English. I was talking about this with my dad. I was like, do you think that we actually developed parts of that completely uniquely, or do you think it was all modified English? He says, I think a lot of it was you couldn't say a word right, and then it would just evolve out of control, and you're saying something that sounds nothing like the word. But in some cases, it might have been, I'm speaking gibberish because that's what babies do, and my brother's listening to me, and then we see something that we both like. So we see a cat or something, and then he would interpret whatever noise that I just made as the happy noise. Signaling can happen between animals. Humans need not apply. This is a coyote signaling to a badger that he wants to go on a hunt.
That really is cool.
Coyotes and badgers make these partnerships all over North America. This is super common. The coyotes usually initiate it. Coyotes are way better at catching ground squirrels and so on if a badger is helping. And actually badgers are better at catching them if a coyote is helping. But it's more beneficial for the coyote. So you almost always see the coyote initiating these relationships.
Wow, that's incredible. That's so cool.
Yeah. And the badger will bail on him as soon as he's mating. So he's like, sorry, the wife ain't letting me go on a hunting trip with you anymore. It's kind of funny. So how do encoding, decoding rules evolve? That's the big question, right? We know how they emerge with animals with thinking minds. How do they evolve? And there's a bunch of them. We see them everywhere in nature. Flowers are an example that I've talked about earlier. Really complex signaling that's happening. And different flowers actually have signals that are species specific. They're trying to get specific types of pollinators to visit them. There's exclusion in different languages, you could say, signaling systems that have emerged between flowers and pollinators.
Yeah, it's like some of them have evolved basically only to get hummingbirds, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're trying to exclude other things, and other things through experience. They're like, okay, I keep going to this flower. It's a bright color, but where's the nectar? I can't get to it. Yeah. And so after having that interaction a couple of times, they're They're like, screw this thing, it's not good. So they'll go look for another one. So angiosperms are these flowering plants, and this is kind of a tangent here, but every Valentine's Day, the flower is actually the plant's genitals. And so I like to send out this meme. As a token of my affection, please accept this bouquet of severed angiosperm genitals.
All right, I'm stealing that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, we're brutal. We are savage.
Well, see, like flowers have never made much sense to me. I'm just thinking, we here you go. I've ended the lives of several beautiful things to show that I care, and it's like, what the hell is this? But I actually think that what you've got there is better. That's beautiful.
They can usually regrow their genitals. Okay, it's not necessarily fatal to castrate a flower.
Fine. Yeah. Fair enough.
But yeah, to castrate a plant. But yeah, it is funny. It's hilarious, and we put our face in them. You know, like we.
Well, the other thing is that they put the food on their genitals for other animals to come and eat from.
Yeah. So
I really. If someone had just tuned in now, that'd be a great time.
Right. So gymnosperms, or sometimes called gymnosperms, they are non-flowering plants. They have pine cones and so on instead. And they're pollinated by just the wind. A lot of their species are. If you look at what they're doing here, they're producing all sorts of pollen. So the cycad plant is a really common gymnosperm that a lot of people are aware of. We use them as house plants and stuff. If you go look at the pine cones of these things, a lot of times they're infested with beetles. And these beetles are eating pollen. They are pollen predators. And you'd think this is horrible, this thing's being attacked by these pollen predators. That would have been horrible early on in this relationship. But when a plant is having its pollen eaten, any mutation that makes its pollen grains stick to a predator actually might end up being beneficial for that plant. Whether it grows hairs on it that end up sticking to hairs on the predator, or it's actually just physically sticky. There's 1,000 ways to skin a cat, right? Whatever mutation happens that makes the pollen stick to these predators, when those predators go to the next plant, the next pine cones, there's a pretty high chance they're going to spread that pollen to the other plant. And if you think about it, that's a direct line. It's a lot more efficient than the wind. These predators are going to go from one plant to another. They're searching for pollen, but they're going to go to the female pine cones as well, checking those out. You can actually get to the point to where there's a selection advantage for having pollen predators, better than the wind. At this point, when the predator is a more efficient pollinator than the wind, even despite the fact that it's eating the pollen, a large percentage of the pollen, well, most of your pollen just spills on the ground if you're wind pollinated. There's going to be a point in your evolutionary history where you benefit from being infested with these beetles. And so any cues that you were passively transmitting before that the beetle was picking up on, maybe it's the color of your pine cones, maybe it's something about the smell of the pine cones. If you can magnify any of those cues, you're going to get more pollen predators to come. You're going to get more efficient pollination.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
You get the evolution of a signal.
Which essentially describes why you'd have these plants that reproduce by using the wind. They scatter what is a lot of resources into the wind, and then it goes elsewhere. And it's basically like a shotgun technique where they're just like, I hope I hit. Whereas at some point, predators came and got involved, and basically a selection process made it so that there was a co-evolution between the two. Then they have to produce way less material. It's not as costly. Yeah, once that happens, where you can use that energy in different ways, such as growing bigger or, taking up more of the sun's rays or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And if you look at a flower, flowers produce pollen, and a lot of pollinators eat pollen, and they also eat nectar. Nectar you can think of as a bribe, because sugar is the easiest thing in the world for a plant to make. It makes it by just sitting in the sun. Pollen is pretty biologically expensive for a plant to make. You can think of, how might this have started out? The flowers, plants bleed, and they bleed sugary substances. Well, if an insect is looking for pollen and it's also getting a nice tasty treat there, well, it might spend more time on that tasty treat than eating the pollen, but it's also there. And then it goes to the next plant that looks the same. It's like, oh, that was good. I drank all the sugary blood. It's gone. I wonder if that other one has it. The coevolution of this is super fascinating. The pollinators are evolving to better detect the plants that are good, giving them good things. And the plants are evolving to give better things to the pollinators, to bribe them, and to make it very obvious that they exist. There's a coevolution happening. Without a mind necessary. This is happening automatically through descent with modification acted upon by selection.
Yeah, Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you're a theist, and, you know, as I said, like, most theists accept evolution by natural selection, and this is a wonderful thing. I mean, for me, it is a very serious argument from evil kind of thing, because I think natural selection is very, very, very brutal, but it can also be conceived as just an incredible process that God would be using. So it's amazing how, like, you get this rhetoric where they try and portray evolution. The creationists do this a lot, and I've seen this from apologists who push creationism. They try and make out that you're either with God or you accept evolution, and that's just not true. Like, the vast majority of Christians, well, not vast majority, but the majority do accept evolution.
Finally. So a Q, again, we're definitely overdriving this point home, but I think it's important because it's such a cool concept, and it actually does take a while to wrap your head around. A Q is any passive transmission that a sender makes that can be detected by another organism. A signal is any transmission actively magnified by a sender, because its reception by a receiver helps the sender better survive and reproduce. In the case of that cycad plant, being detected by a pollen predator actually helps it survive. And so it starts magnifying. Evolution drives it to magnify those signals. It's magnifying the cues that the beetle was already using to detect. So it just magnifies those, and they're transformed into a signal. Signals can develop when two or more thinking entities are motivated to cooperate. So Zoe and I were motivated to cooperate. Signals can evolve when two or more evolving entities are under selection pressure to cooperate, and it becomes a co-evolution process.
Just a quick question related to the signals. If you have the natural selection that happens within our bodies, so that, you know, you've got a production of testosterone that is sending signals for the growth of the beard, is it any different inside an organism as opposed to outside of the organism, where you've got like two different organisms that are interacting, or you've got two different parts of the DNA within someone that's interacting? I don't know if I'm using the right language here, but hopefully you get the question. Is there anything different in terms of signaling?
It's actually the same thing. You have different entities inside the body that are physically apart from each other. There's information that one has that the other could benefit from, and they're transmitting that. It's really the same thing. The point of encoding and decoding is to transmit messages through some sort of a channel that could not otherwise be transmitted without encoding and decoding. It really is the same principle. One of the things that happens inside the body is that you have there's more selection pressure to cooperate within a single organism than there is between any two organisms, because you're the same organism. Like the whole thing either dies or lives together. There's no ambiguity there. The big difference here is that selection pressure to cooperate is much more intense within the body, between bodies, right? Here's an example of a signaling system that's hijacked. This is now coercion. This is a flower has evolved to seduce a bee into mating with it. So the bee gets no nectar, nothing, doesn't eat any pollen. He just humps this thing and then flies away. And here's a bee actually doing it. It thinks that's a female, because the plant sends out a molecule that's so similar to the female hormone that it thinks it's met a female in estrus. So that's actually not called communication in biology. That's called coercion.
See, yeah, because it's not. Yeah, one of them is mistaking the signal, and so, as you said, you don't have the communication like that. Yeah. Well,
saying that they're mistaking is a little bit mistaken, because I think in general you could say that there's mistaking happening. Like whenever a flower is sending a signal to a pollinator, it's basically, if you want to interpret what it's saying, you'd say it's saying, "Come pollinate me." The insect is hearing, "Come eat." So there's always a mistake if you want to really interpret that. But in this case, the bee is being taken advantage of, and they actually sometimes they'll actually ejaculate. And for a bee, that's a huge loss, because sperm is difficult for them to produce. It's a selective disadvantage for the bee to participate in this. We don't even consider it a signaling system. We consider it a coercion system.
I see.
We think that the bee is being hurt by this transaction.
Yeah, okay.
It's actually kind of hard to know for sure, because maybe they're also getting practice.
Yeah, it seems like the interpretation is a difficult part here. It's like where there's bits of ambiguity, and like, fair enough, we might not know the answers to these things. We can speculate, theorize, and whatnot. It's a bit like if you take that plant to be your dog in the bath, you, like that bee, misunderstood what was happening, but you didn't have a cost, whereas, as you said, that bee does, because it's expensive for them to produce sperm. So
yeah, and actually there was a cost for me when Zoe started using the signal falsely, when she just wanted attention. That was a cost for me, because I'd get up from work and I'd lose my focus, and then my dog just wants me to pet her. I'm like, no, that's not how this works.
Exactly.
So,
but that's why you use the word cue, I guess.
Yeah, it started out as a cue. It became a signal. And then when she started misusing it, the communication eventually broke down, because I stopped responding to it, and then she stopped transmitting it because it was no longer useful. You can actually get these signaling systems to break down. So with these bees, if this really is sufficiently detrimental to these bees, the system will actually break down eventually, because there will be selection pressure. Any bee that happens to be able to distinguish between a flower and a female will have a huge selection advantage over males that keep losing all of their energy mating with flowers. If it's too exploitive, the signal will actually break down. The coercion will break down. So coercion, dishonesty in signaling is actually always kept in check because of this. The signaling system will actually break down if it becomes obvious. And the same is true with language. I mean, if someone keeps lying to you, stop listening to them.
Yep.
Communication systems can emerge naturally. Thinking minds are not required to design them. I think we're cool with that, right?
I am. I don't know if creationists would be, but yeah, I am. Like, I can absolutely see how all of these things emerge. That they don't, there's nothing to it. Since Darwin, it just changes everything. It really does.
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, the only new thing here that we're really showing is that there's coevolution happening to form a language. Is that you need that coevolution. It can't just be one entity. It's got to be both of these entities evolving in this type of arms race for more clarity, essentially.
Yeah, so on that front, actually, this is probably a good thing to quickly emphasize, is that coevolution, in the name, it's a cooperative between two different things, whereas you would think that if this evolved naturally, then your mind might go to thinking, well, at one point it must have been one, because that's simpler. But I guess the way you could conceive this is, if we know that early life didn't reproduce via sexual reproduction, they just split, and that's what it was. If you could have one thing and then it splits, and there's a slight difference because of the information isn't completely copied over perfectly with the genetic mutation, and then you've got technically two different things, as long as they're surviving and not being pulled out of the gene pool from natural selection.
Then you've got two things, and that's what you need to be able to eventually be able to get this coevolution between the two, and then you've got your language. So I just wanted to put that on the table, because that's the way that I obviously don't know much about biology, but that's where I would suspect that there might be an answer there.
You do need at least two entities, in order for this to work. For the emergence of symbol-based communication systems. These molecules are symbols that are being passed in the urine. They're functioning as symbols. They don't mean anything outside of this communication system, right? So if you smell the dog urine in estrus, it means nothing to you.
Nope.
It means a lot to a wolf. It means everything to a wolf. Now I'm making the most technical argument is that the genetic code is a simple language. It is a signal-based communication system, and this is where we're going to have to learn some biochemistry. So this is the thing that we call the genetic code. More specifically, this would be like a dictionary for the genetic code. And it shows us the codons, which are symbols, and it shows us the amino acids that those symbols represent. And this is confusing for people to think about when they first hear about this, because they're looking at a chart that has letters on it, and letters are symbols. So we've got symbolic labels for symbols. We're swimming in symbols here. What is going on? So I'm going to try and show this very carefully here. What the hell is happening when I say that these are symbols? So all of our functional bits, not all of them, our most interesting functional bits are proteins. These are the things people call machines oftentimes, because they can get so complex. So here I'm showing a really simple cartoon version of hemoglobin, which is the protein in our blood that can capture oxygen and then release it when the time is appropriate. And that's what's inside of red blood cells. That's what gives them their red color, actually. So hemoglobin is this really complex protein. It's got multiple parts to it. It's giant protein. Proteins are strings of smaller molecules that are attached to each other called amino acids. So a bunch of amino acids line up in a string, and then they fold into a particular type of protein. This is what the amino acids actually look like. So there's my silly cartoon amino acids. Here's what they actually look like in space filling model. For people that aren't used to seeing these, that's showing every atom in that molecule. So this is the amino acid called arginine. The label that we have for arginine is the word arginine, and then the abbreviated label is ARG. Those are labels that we're putting on top of this, but it's actually a molecule. The colors here represent the types of atoms. So red is oxygen, blue is nitrogen, dark gray is carbon, and the white is hydrogen. That's the atoms. Atoms aren't really colored in real life, but this is roughly the actual shape of that molecule. Here we have glycine. It's another amino acid, much smaller, much simpler. Here we have serine. So there are 20 different amino acids that proteins in humans are made of. There are actually 2 more that some organisms use that we don't.
Yeah, and I think in those experiments with abiogenesis, they made even more amino acids, if I'm not mistaken, which is fascinating.
As far as that exist in the world of chemistry, there's I don't know how many there are, but there's lots.
Yeah, bit of a trivia for you. In the bodybuilding community, you can get glutamine powder.
Yeah.
It tastes horrendous. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, you can buy all of these because certain diets will be low in some. Some of them our bodies can actually build. We have the chemistry to actually build them from pretty much anything that we eat. Others we have to eat full. It has to be in our food. Long story short, amino acids make up proteins. Proteins make up living cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. And then there's you, right? So that's the thing. The big question is how do amino acids line up to form specific proteins? And that is the job of protein coding done by DNA. That's the thing that DNA does. That's the thing that the genetic code does. It allows genes to communicate to the ribosome, which is the protein building machine, and it tells them specifically how to build a specific type of protein. So now we're gonna look at a quick little clip from, it's actually the first animation I ever did for Stated Clearly, from what is DNA and how does it work. This here is a simplified model of DNA. It shows us that the steps of the ladder are made up of 4 different kinds of chemicals shown here by different colors and letters. If you look at just one half of the molecule, you can read its chemical sequence from top to bottom, sort of like a book. A single strand of DNA is extremely long, millions of letters long. It spends most of its life coiled up like a noodle, living inside the nucleus or the centerpiece of a cell. Amino acids, however, live outside the nucleus in what's called the cytoplasm. To help DNA interact with the cytoplasm and convert those amino acids into proteins, special chemicals inside the nucleus make partial copies of the DNA called RNA. These partial copies look a lot like DNA, but they're shorter, of course, and they're missing one of their sides. Their small shape and size allows them to fit through tiny pores in the nucleus, out to the cytoplasm, and into the mouth of another particle called a ribosome. Ribosomes are protein-building machines. They read the RNA 3 letters at a time, suck amino acids out of their surroundings, and stick them together in a chain according to the RNA code. As the chain grows, it bends, it folds, and it sticks to itself to form a perfectly shaped protein. Every 3 letters of the RNA tell the ribosome which of the 20 different kinds of amino acids should be added next. For example, CAA tells the ribosome to grab a glutamine. AGU tells it to grab a serine, and so on. Once a protein is built, it can then go on to do a number of different things, one of which could be to help form a brand new cell. Here is DNA. We just saw in that animation that every 3 letters, I called it the RNA code in that video, which is wrong. It's the genetic code. Every 3 letters in that RNA represent an amino acid. It tells the ribosome to grab a specific amino acid. So what do I mean by letters? Obviously, there aren't actually letters in DNA. So letters are labels that we put on actual molecules that exist, subparticles of a chain of DNA. And these represent the molecule thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine. So that's TCAG. And in RNA, it's a little bit different. You've got uracil instead of thymine. It changes to uracil in RNA. And RNA is also single-stranded. Tends to be. Messenger RNAs are single-stranded. So those things, those nucleotides, those are molecules. So this is what guanine looks like in space-filling mode. So guanine is this molecule. This is what cytosine looks like in space-filling mode. Every 3 sets of nucleotides is what we call a codon. It's a set of molecules, so that's the GGG codon. It's 3 of these nucleotides, the G nucleotides next to each other. The CG codon, if we draw it in a more realistic form, would look like that. These are 3-dimensional structures. These have been adopted as symbols in the genetic code that the ribosome recognizes. The ribosome recognizes GGG as a symbol for glycine. When it's reading a chain of RNA and it grabs that 3-dimensional shape changes its structure, allowing it to grab glycine out of the environment. This involves another molecule called transfer RNA as well. I'm not going to complicate things by going into that here, though. This is a physical process. In your video, you say that this language is just physics, and so it's not really a language. All languages are based on physics, right? I'm making noises with my mouth right now.
This is actually something I didn't know very well, and that you've helped me with, absolutely understanding that these things are all physical. It's just very easy to not see them as such because of the way that they present themselves. So yeah, that's also a very good point that you've definitely switched my mind on.
The thing is that your brain has to be set up in advance to interpret these physical things that I'm sending you, these physical sound vibrations. Your brain has to be set up in advance to essentially know what those mean. The meaning has to be established in advance. And that's what's happened between the messenger RNA and the ribosome. There has been a long evolutionary history establishing the meaning of these symbols. These 3 nucleotides, guanine, 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 really are a symbol representing glycine in the genetic code. On the actual chart here, I've got the GGG highlighted in pink over here, and I've got it circled. And that represents glycine. And so this shows you how this code chart works. GGG represents glycine, and you also notice here that there's a bunch of other codons that can also represent glycine. There's redundancy in the genetic code. It's robust. There are certain mutations that you can suffer that won't change the sequence of a protein that your specific gene codes for because there is some redundancy in the genetic code. The other important thing to point out here's arginine, which is a different amino acid, and it's represented by cytosine, guanine, cytosine. So it's a different codon that codes for arginine, and so on. You can go all the way down this thing. And then you have start codons. So AUG, that tells the ribosome to start building protein at this part in the message. So it clamps on and starts building. So everything after that AUG is going to be part of the protein. Actually, AUG will be part of the protein too. That actually codes for an amino acid. And then it's going to keep on building this protein, which bends and folds, sticks to itself to form this 3-dimensional specific shape until it reaches a stop codon, which there's 3 different stop codons. There's UAA, UAG, and UGA. If the ribosome hits one of those, it's going to fall off of the chain of RNA, and the protein is going to be released. It's done building that protein. There's syntax in this language. There's start, there's stop. You have to do things in order or else it's not going to work. So we have symbols and we have syntax. Those are 2 linguistic traits. So when a creationist calls this a language, whether or not they understand what they're even saying.
Well, yes, I would say that it depends on how they're defining language.
Yeah.
But yes, absolutely, that is a language.
And again, most biologists the tradition is to call it a code. But even if you look at programming, if it's a simple programming language, people a lot of times call it a code. If it's complex, they'll call it a language. It's just kind of, there's not an official cutoff here. But
well, just to really dot the I's and cross the T's here, I think it really does just come down to definition of language, because if someone wants to define this as the way that we've unpacked before, as John Lennox and Ken Ham does, then it's just wrong to say that this is necessarily a language.
Yeah.
They've got all their work ahead of them to prove it. Whereas if they use the proper definition, well, all the contention is going to be on whether or not that can emerge naturally. And the evidence very much indicates that it does.
Again, I want to say it's not like biologists all use the same definition that is perfect to use here. It's that if we look at all of the different types of definitions that people are using for language, the genetic code has linguistic properties. You could argue that it's not a full-on language the way that English is, because it's so much simpler. Like, think about, okay, this is our dictionary here, this genetic code. It's only like 64 words long. English has how many? Over 100,000? Yeah. Most English speakers know, they use something like 20,000, I think. Yeah. And then they know like 40,000. Compare that to this language, it's only got 64. It's ridiculously simple compared to English. Incredibly simple. So simple, in fact, that you could make the argument that we shouldn't call it a language, we should call it a code. Yeah. And then most biologists call it a code. They don't call it a language. But it really does have these linguistic properties, those properties, specific properties being that there are symbols here, real symbols, and that there are syntax rules here. The order of things matters. Those are the two ways in which it's correct to say that this is a language. And I think to admit that and agree with them on that.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
The standard genetic code was cracked in the mid-60s, and then the researchers got the Nobel Prize in 1968 for discovering this genetic code. And if you think about it, like, this could have been arranged in actually not just millions of different ways, not just trillions of different ways. I think it's like 10 to the 84 to the power of 80. So like 10 with like 84 zeros behind it, something like that. Possible different codes that could have come into existence, but this is the one that we have. So when we say that these codon assignments are made arbitrarily, they're made really arbitrarily. They could have been made in a bunch of different ways. There actually are some organisms that use a slightly different version of the genetic code. There are different symbols that they use. So, like we said, another property of language is that you can not speak the right language, and then it can cause miscommunication. Our mitochondria use a slightly different genetic code than the nucleus of the cells. And so if a gene from the nucleus is used in the mitochondria, it can be misread. So there can be miscommunication because of a language barrier in that case.
Yeah. So a thing I wanted to emphasize here, because I can feel in the ether that some minds are going here. Yeah. The fact that it could have been so many different ways, right? But we've got one specific way. A lot of theists, I've noticed, especially if they are sympathetic to the fine-tuning argument, which teleological arguments, creationism in general is, they tend to look at it and go, see, the fact that there were all these different ways that it could have come up, but it came up with this one way, is evidence that it was selected intelligently to do so. And I just want to say that a good analogy, or analogy that I like, is if you roll a six-sided dice and you roll it 5 times in a row and you try and predict what, you go, all right, I'm going to get a 6, a 6, a 6, a 6, and a 6. The chances of that happening is 1 in about 7,724, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. The thing is, if you had said, oh, I'm going to get a 1, a 3, a 3, a 5, a 4, and a 6, guess what the chances of that coming up was? Is exactly the same. Yeah. And so it's very easy, I find, for people to look at something and imbue it with something more meaningful because it has this. There could have been so many other numbers that came up, when actually it just follows that it's not all of the numbers are that rare. The
only thing that matters here is that the sender and the receiver have an established meaning for a symbol, right? Yeah. That's what matters. It's been established. You could take a gene that already exists. You could completely change the genetic code, change all these rules that are on this chart. Yep. You could see how you have to edit the gene so that it still works exactly the same way as it did before, because you just changed the nucleotide sequence in the gene. And because these things co-evolved, they co-evolved together. It's just like English. Like, I learned English as I was a kid. That's what my parents were speaking. New genes that come into existence, they're going to have beneficial functions if they use the genetic code to code for something that's functional, right? They're under selection pressure. They don't get to reinvent the language, right? Yeah. The language was established in the distant past. It's pretty much unmutable now. It's not completely unmutable. Like, it has changed in some organisms slightly, but very slightly, actually. It's almost universal. The really important thing is to drive home this point that codon assignments were somehow made in the past. Now, this brings us to the big question that a lot of people who are here really want to hear me answer, and that is, how the heck did the genetic code evolve? This, if you recall, is the question that Carl Woese had. He wanted to know how codon assignments were made. Somehow, these codons were assigned to represent specific amino acids. How did that happen? Well, we know from earlier that signals can evolve when two or more evolving entities are under selection pressure to cooperate. This here is a space-filling model of the ribosome. You have the top part and the bottom part which clamp onto a messenger RNA and read that RNA. To the right, I have some transfer RNAs. These are the molecules that bring amino acids to the ribosome so that it can actually build a protein as it's reading the chain of messenger RNA. Here we have multiple different entities that are capable of evolution. These are large biomolecules. Mutations can change their shapes. Mutations can change how they function. One of Carl Woese's big discoveries, it wasn't fully his discovery, but one of the things he really drove home is that the functional bits of all of these parts here, the transfer RNAs and the ribosome itself, the functional bits of these molecules are made of RNA. So in this model here, the blue parts, those are protein, and everything that's sort of this yellowish pink, all of that is RNA. This is really unusual for biomolecules in our bodies. Most biomolecules, most of the functional bits of our cells are made of protein. The ribosome is one of the big exceptions to this. Its functional bits are RNA. And Carl Woese drove this point home really hard because there is this thing called the RNA world hypothesis that scientists had already been talking about before he drove these points home. And the RNA world hypothesis, it's still just a hypothesis. There's lots of aspects of it that have not yet been worked out. But the RNA world hypothesis is this idea that before we had complex proteins, before we had DNA, we just had chains of RNA that were evolving. The world that they existed in probably did have amino acids in it, and it probably had short chains of amino acids. We wouldn't really call them proteins because they weren't evolved functional structures, but we call them peptides, short chains of amino acids, really tiny proteins, you could think of them as. So this environment was somehow generating chains of RNA, and it was somehow generating short peptides and amino acids. And the hypothesis proposes that these chains of RNA could replicate. And it has been shown through experiments that chains of RNA can replicate under certain conditions. So far, we haven't found prebiotically plausible environments that will allow chains of RNA to be produced and then to replicate. So that's one of the big problems of the RNA world hypothesis. But chains of RNA can evolve. They are evolving entities. And so it is not difficult to understand loosely, in principle, how the genetic code could have evolved. Of course, the details are not worked out. But let me give you just a really, really general scenario. Now, just a quick apology, I haven't yet done an animation on the evolution of the genetic code, so pardon the makeshift graphics that I'm using here. I'm going to rig this together with bits of animation from my RNA World video, along with some still images to fill in the gaps. Strands of RNA, all on their own, without any sort of protein, they're not very stable. If they exist in an environment that fluctuates in temperature or fluctuates in pH, they can break apart pretty rapidly. And what this means is that very early on, the types of mutations that would have been selected for are mutations that allowed a chain of RNA to become more stable. One way for a chain of RNA to become stable is to fold in and base pair with itself and form these glob-like structures. So it's a chain of RNA, but under certain conditions it will fold in and attach to itself into a glob, and these globs are a lot more stable than loose chains of RNA would be. The ribosome does this. The modern ribosome folds into a glob. It's actually chains of RNA that it's made out of, and those chains fold into globs that are nice and secure. And another type of mutation that would be selected for is the ability to grab onto other molecules in the environment and use those to stabilize its own structure. Again, the modern ribosome is also doing this. It attaches itself to proteins to stabilize its own structure. That's what these blue parts are here in this drawing. They are proteins that are stabilizing the ribosome structure. And by the way, when we do RNA experiments, just RNA evolution experiments, we see chains of RNA evolve towards glob-like structures, and we see them evolve the ability to attach to other molecules. So we know from laboratory experiments that replicating chains of RNA are capable of evolving both of these functions. It's super easy. It happens almost immediately when you start an RNA evolution experiment. So if you grant that there were at one time chains of evolving RNA, or something similar to RNA. And by the way, even if you don't want to grant this, that's fine, because there's lots of other scenarios that would work for this as well. Right now, scientists don't know exactly what the early life situation was. Lauren Williams, who's one of the big researchers studying the origin of the ribosome, all of the models that he builds, they don't require the RNA world scenario. But if you grant, for example, that there were chains of RNA evolving in true Darwinian fashion, descent with modification, acted upon by selection. These chains of RNA were replicating. And there were random peptides being generated by the environment. You would have had lots of chains of RNA that had evolved to fold in on themselves into nice little stable globs, and you would have lots of chains of RNA that have evolved to grab onto small peptides in their environment. So the RNA world would have been full of these types of critters, these glob-forming critters and these protein-grabbing critters. All of the RNA critters that need to grab onto peptides, these mini proteins, they're going to be in competition with each other. These peptides are going to be a limited resource. RNA chains that happen to be slower at binding, well, they're out of the game. At the core of the ribosome, we find bits of RNA that are able to grab amino acids and essentially smash them together to form a short peptide, or deoxypeptide if hydroxy acids are in the mix as well. The automatic consequence of building these peptides is that these little proto-ribosomes always have plenty of peptides to stabilize their own bodies. They never really run out. And early on, this would have been done randomly. They'd be grabbing either short chains of amino acids or maybe single amino acids and smashing them together to form chains. And these would be random amino acids that they're grabbing. There's no control. There's no protein coding happening. They're just grabbing whatever there is, smashing it together. Even just this little core bit of the ribosome is already something that would be better at surviving than other random chains of RNA. Once you have little peptide-making machines floating around in the environment, the door is open for coevolution. This is because simple peptide makers don't stop making peptides once they have enough for themselves. They keep going indefinitely, and they go as fast as they happen to come across amino acids. Other chains of RNA can help themselves by helping the ribosome collect amino acids and form peptides. So here we have an explanation for why the core of the ribosome might have been selected for early on, and why other chains of RNA, I'll call them amino acid finders, could have been selected for early on to help themselves by helping the ribosome. So you've got multiple little RNA organisms exploiting the ribosome's abilities, and the genetic code could have evolved under selection pressure for these teams to cooperate more and more efficiently in the construction of proteins, and in the construction of proteins that are more and more specific. You start out with very random proteins that they're able to build, and then as more and more players join in and compete in the highly competitive ribosome feeding game, the system as a whole gradually becomes more and more specific in the types of peptides it can build. Eventually, the system's behavior can be described with a chart like this, a chart that we call the genetic code. Now that is just a ridiculous cartoon version of how this scenario could have played out in the history of life. Lauren Williams over at Georgia Tech, his group recently published a wonderful paper called Root of the Tree, The Significance, Evolution, and Origin of the Ribosome. Much more of a big boys overview, what is known about the ribosome's origin and what is still a mystery. Word of warning, it is a bit of a rough read if you're not a biochemist, but it is definitely the place to start for anyone who wants to dive in deep. But the thing that I want everyone to understand, including creationists, including atheists that are arguing with creationists, is that we know that signals can evolve when two or more evolving entities are under selection pressure to cooperate. The ribosome and the entire translation system is made of multiple evolving entities that are cooperating in the construction of protein. In this case, those evolvable entities are messenger RNA, also known as genes, ribosomal RNA, and transfer RNA. So, a message for our dear friends Ken Ham and John Lennox. Language can also emerge through coevolution. I suppose it's possible that Jesus designed the genetic code, but it's also possible the genetic code formed between genes and ribosomes as they co-evolved to build proteins. Scientists are actively investigating if it evolved, exactly how that would have happened. They're actually doing real research, they're building models, and they're testing those models. Creationists are doing nothing of the sort. Instead, they're just complaining and misrepresenting the science.
Would this be a fair thing to say? In Paley's time, they were looking at, the structure of the hand. And they were saying, we just do not know how this emerged. And it's fair enough to say this really is a wonderful thing. The eye really is a wonderful thing. Like, to say that it's not a wonderful, biologically complex thing is just wrong. Like, no, it is. And that's where the God of the Gaps was. And then Darwin came along, figured it out. And the refuge for God at the moment is the gap that is the ribosome. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
It's actually overly fair. We understand how signaling systems emerge. We understand that you need multiple entities under selection pressure to cooperate, and you can get the evolution of signaling systems. It's the very fine-tuned specific details that we don't yet know about the origin of the ribosome.
Well, at the beginning, you were saying to me you're encouraging a stillman approach, right? Which is something I didn't take in my original video. And if we end here, if we get to, as we have now here, where I've given a stillman and you said that's more than fair, it sounds like we're probably on the right path with the remaster.
I just want to point out to people that you can try and read these papers if you dare. Very technical about the ribosome. To understand these papers, you actually need a pretty... Well, actually, the root of the tree one tries to give you a good understanding of the ribosome's actual structure itself, too. To understand these other ones, you have to really understand a lot about the coding system. There's a really cool paper right here called What is Code Biology by Marcello, I think it's an Italian name, Barbieri. I'm probably pronouncing it completely wrong, but he's arguing for the value in looking at biological systems as coding systems. You can study a coding system by its mechanical bits, or you can study it by the code structure itself. You can study language by how mouths move and vibrations are formed, or you can study it by how sentence structure works and so on. He's arguing that we should actually spend more time looking at biology from a coding perspective, from a linguistic type perspective. He makes some pretty good arguments in here. I don't agree with everything he says in there, but he makes some pretty good arguments. There's a lot of value to be had in this, and it's not really something that we do. Most biologists focus on the structures and physically how things are happening. People like Dawkins, who were studying signaling in birds, he was really focused more on kind of the linguistic side of what these birds are doing. But Lauren Williams, who wrote the one on the root of the tree here, he's hyper-focused on structure. He actually doesn't like thinking about it all as code or as linguistics. He just wants to focus on the structure of these things, which is also fair. It's a fair angle to take. There's a lot to be had from both of these perspectives and combining them. And then one other one, this is by a philosopher of language, T.C. Scott Phillips, who goes through and talks really specifically about how we think about signaling in biology and why it's so important to think about things being adaptive before you call it a signal. He summarizes the work of Richard Dawkins, Stuart West, a bunch of people who have been focused on signaling in animals, and he does a good job. The jargon, it's almost like, dude, you're going too far with this, but it's important. It's important to go far with this when you're really trying to understand
this is just the
concepts.
nature of these papers, right? Like you get it with, I read quite a few papers on metaphysics, and the jargon's just so rich. They've created their own language, John. That's what they've done.
Yeah, they have.
Honestly, this whole process has been just very edifying for me, and
cool.
Yeah, I absolutely do understand it more. And I feel like I understand it more because when I tried to stillman it, you said, yes, that's fair enough, and that's a good thing. Yeah, I will remake the video. Just thanks for reaching out and all the rest of it. And also to the, is it Sai that you mentioned? I
Yeah,
didn't
Saigar,
manage
yeah.
to see his video until very recently, mainly because no one had linked it to me, or
Yeah.
probably someone had, but I get
Yeah.
quite a lot of links and quite a lot of responses. But just, yeah, thanks for making the video. I appreciate it. I'll
Yeah.
try and do a better job with this remaster. Hopefully you can check it over. That'd be
Oh, yeah,
brilliant.
yeah, I'd be happy. I'd be happy to pop in on it too sometime if
That'd be
need
awesome. That'd be really, really cool. But mainly, I just want to say that, reiterate what I said at the beginning, John. I really appreciate your work.
Well, this was fun, and as I mentioned before, it's just really cool to have someone who wants to actually, like, I publicly made a thing about this. If I admit that I was wrong, I get egg on my face, but I still want to do it because I'm interested in understanding how this works, not being right at all costs. I mean, I almost want to call it heroic, even though it might seem overly flattering, but it's so freaking rare for people to do this. I used to think that there was something special about religion that made people unwilling to accept new ideas. But humans, we are aggressive in not wanting to change our thinking.
Yeah, that lowly stamp isn't just a remark against religion. That's on humans, right? I've been through the same experience. When I was young, I thought maybe, other communities don't have it. But what I've realized as I got older is religion's not a problem. Like, someone's religion is their religion. It's none of my business. It's the dogma and tribalism that tends to be very present in religion, but it's not just religion. You'll get it in all sorts of communities, even in academia. You don't even have to mention politics and whatnot. And a lot of it is to do with reputation and preservation, and to admit that you're wrong on something it's seen as a weakness in basically every culture. But I don't see it that way. I think it's a strength. And if your goal is truth, if your goal is figuring out what this world's about, whether or not there is a God, etc., then it just seems very obvious to me that the right answer is to just humbly admit you're not going to know everything and that you are going to mess up. And most importantly, that's okay, right? We're human. Yeah. We're all going to do it. And it's just part of the process. So enjoy it when it happens. You've calmly educated me here. I'm going to go home and cry. It's all brilliant. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, thanks for doing this. This was fun. So long.